Well, Henry, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a real pleasure to have you as my guest on the first of my occasional podcast series.
Thank you for inviting me.
And the reason I invited you is because I find your columns in The Australian fascinating, your depth of knowledge and wealth of experience really engaging. But I think it was particularly an article that you wrote along with Alex McDermott on the multiculturalism, and you spoke about Gough Whitlam's multiculturalism experiment has failed Australia. Now, I found that a really engaging title and an engaging article. Why would I find it so fascinating? Well, I guess I need to have a declaration of interest here. I was Minister of what was initially Ethnic Affairs, and later I changed it to Multicultural and Ethnic Affairs in the State Labor Government of South Australia from 1989 to 1993. I'd also been particularly involved in multicultural engagement in education. When I was Education Minister, I commissioned what's known as the Smollet's Report towards a cultural democracy. So I'm being very engaged with the multicultural project, and yet when I read your article, there was a lot in it that I resonated with, because it made me think that we do actually have some serious issues about multiculturalism and what we should be doing. And before I ask you to sort of summarize some of your views on that, just a short while ago in the Weekend Australian, Angela Shanahan wrote an article, "Don't Blame Multiculturalism for Social Woes." And in the process she said, I speak from experience when I say multiculturalism, which gave all cultures and ethnicities an equal standing in the project that is modern Australia, has been a great boon. And yet, in your article with Alex, you take issue with that.
Yes, we do, in the sense that at the heart of our concern is how you preserve a sense of national unity and identity unless you have some overarching commonality of what might broadly be called culture. And what we argue is that Australia's historical success was due to its ability to accommodate people of quite different origins in a venture that would bring them together rather than setting them apart. That the risk involved in multiculturalism as such, particularly as it's currently understood, is that it makes ethnicity into destiny. It divides more than it unites. And it does so at a time when the factors that might bring us together have been weakening. As a result, in that way and a number of other ways, it contributes to fragmentation and even polarization that is currently a feature of Australian society.
You make the point, you and Alex, in the article that at the start of the multicultural project that you date back to the Whitlam era, you say, in its origins, the ambition of this new multiculturalist approach were reasonably modest, trusting implicitly in the continuance of a social code of tolerance built up over the decades. It assumed that code was so strong that it didn't require protecting. And you then follow through, and you actually identify a very important point that came out of the Galbally report under the Fraser government, that multiculturalism was efficacious, provided that ethnic identity is not stressed at the expense of society at large, but is interwoven into the fabric of our nationhood. And you're then further making the point that that's where that has tended to break down, particularly in recent decades. And you say that the overall result is not just a separatism that tears at social cohesion, it is an active hostility to, an incessant attack upon the Australian community. Now, can I just say, years ago I raised the idea that there were two competing possibilities. One is a multicultural possibility, which I actually saw as a unifying, engaging, integrating theme, versus a polycultural thing, which I saw as a kind of numerous separate communities living separately in the same geographical space, but not actually sharing some essential core ideas of what it is to be Australian in our case. I mean, in the article that you and Alex wrote, do you think that there is the possibility that there can be that shared space of core values, or is it something that is now too difficult?
Yeah. Let me step back a moment, if I may, in answering your question or addressing the very valid point that you make and the very interesting distinction that you draw that I believe is a useful one. When I first came across this term multiculturalism, I was slightly puzzled by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was puzzled by it, but I thought, well, as we French speakers say, pourquoi pas? You know, pourquoi
Why
pas?
not?
Why not? Why not? And the reason I was slightly puzzled by it has to do with the nature and meaning of the word culture, in the following sense. That really, insofar as you can go back and look at what is meant by particular concepts, culture, historically, really until the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, culture referred to what we would now call as high culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The culture was the distilled knowledge, and more than knowledge, distilled wisdom.
It didn't even have national boundaries in that context, did it?
No.
It transcended national boundaries.
It transcended national boundaries. It was the culture of cultured people, in if you want to summarize it. And that really changed in the course of the 19th century, where culture became something that societies have. And it changed in part, I would say in significant part, under the impact, on the one hand, of the spread of Europe throughout the world, but also the rise of anthropology as a discipline, or of what became anthropology later on, which was dealing with discrete communities and trying to identify what it was that held those communities together. And that became the concept of culture in a loosely defined anthropological sense.
So the terms French culture or English culture or
the
German
the culture
Chinese
of
culture.
Or the culture of Tahiti or the Polynesian Islands. Now, that was really a summary term for a mode of existence, what Tocqueville would have called the mœurs, the mores of a society. A summary term, which then was expanded into a description of things such as the ways people interrelated, the nature of the bonds between them, what it was that held them together, what it was that made the society work or not work, as the case may be. It always had the risk in it that it reified the concept of culture. It involved, when it was taken too literally, a fallacy of misplaced concreteness, in which culture became an object or a thing, and that you could have a culture in the way that you can have a thing. And that proved particularly problematic when you were talking about societies that were formed by the fusion of people who came from different cultures, thus defined. Because clearly they didn't have, and wouldn't at least continue to have, cultures as a thing. Rather, what would happen is that you'd have a process of what was then called by the sociologists acculturation. And acculturation was the formation of a culture that spanned the cultures that came together. And that was really what had happened historically in Australia when you had the merging in Australia of cultures that had been in the, well, then became the United Kingdom, quite separate. The Scots, the English, the Welsh, and the Irish. And the shock of their coming together was immense, but the way they came together and formed a society that was a relatively harmonious society was through this process of acculturation and of acquisition of what, in your terms, would be multiculturalism, of shared values, but
yes, they had a
distinct
shared
traditions.
footprint of agreeing that they are all part of one project.
Exactly.
But they had quite distinctive, observable cultural differences between themselves in terms of their symbols and behaviours and attitudes.
Yes, but those symbols, behaviours and attitudes that you refer to, over time, merged.
Homogenise, yeah.
They didn't completely disappear, but they certainly merged, and in some cases was more problematic than others. The merger of the Irish was more problematic because of long-standing tensions, but nonetheless, it occurred, and it occurred in a way because no one made those differences into something which ought to be preserved, which was in any case an impossible project because formaldehyde preserves the dead, but it kills the living.
You're suggesting that this aspect of culture required it being dynamic,
exactly,
rather than being, to use your phrase, put in formaldehyde.
Exactly.
Is that part of what you see has been the dilemma of the multicultural project, that there is a tendency to want to preserve some aspects of each of our cultures in formaldehyde, rather than have them be part of a dynamic project?
Yes, it almost seems to denigrate the project of acculturation and the process of acculturation. And the risk really that Alex McDermott and I point to that leads to what you call aptly polyculturalism rather than multiculturalism. The risk is much greater now, I would say, for two reasons. The first reason is that historically, if you came to Australia, and it was obviously a difficult and painful and often heart-wrenching experience for many people, it was a break with the past. And you might get letters and so on and so forth, but in a sense that the past was another country. The past was literally another country. And you could not really continue to live in Australia as if you were elsewhere, whereas nowadays you can.
Yes, and that becomes the polycultural idea that I think about, but I talk about. But in fact, there are situations where for a period of time, polyculturalism is a valid proposition as a culture tries to build the resilience to cope in a now broader, more acculturated context. But one of the other things that I think comes out of all this is that you talk about the original idea of culture, there are precious few monocultures anyway in the world. Arguably, if any, but there's a few that come pretty close to it. Japanese to an extent, Icelandic perhaps to an extent, and so on. So in any situation, there is the meeting of people who carry with them what they will call, for want of a better word, a culture, and how that engages. When the colonial settlers came to Australia, they encountered a diversity of such cultures already here. And then the question is, how does that move forward? Does it move forward in a kind of way that the overbearing culture simply requires everyone shapes up to what they say, or is there some other process? Now, you say, in fact, Australia, before the Multicultural Project, actually had, putting aside things like the White Australia policy, putting aside that, it had a process of a slow gravity of acculturation to work its magic, which was quite a beautiful phrase, I thought. But it still suggested that there needed to be an opportunity for new settlers to, for a time, feel this is my comfort zone.
Yes.
But then at some other point, become engaged more.
Yes, and that certainly happened in Australia, sometimes greater difficulty than others. And you're absolutely right that there was typically a phase of coming to terms with this new environment and trying to form individually and collectively the resilience with which to do so. But this, in a way, comes back to one of the most long-standing debates in social theory, which is, what is it that holds a society together? And, or in George Simmels' famous question, how is society possible? And how is modern society possible was the question for Simmel, because he said, well, previous societies were possible because of the weight of tradition. But in modern societies, the weight of tradition is much weaker, and hence there must be other integrative mechanisms. And what Simmel identified was what he called the process of association. And what that meant, and he thought this was very distinctive of modern societies as he observed them, what that meant was that one had overlapping communities. And let me just give you an example of that. When you and I were young, or at least when I was young, people were members of many different things. They might be members of a faith community, they might be members of sporting clubs, they might be members of
stamp collecting and so
stamp
on.
collecting,
in our
chess
youth.
clubs, organizations such as Rotary or Lions Club, the service clubs as they were called. They might be members of a political party. And in each of those, they were interacting with people who were slightly different from them. Moreover, those differences were different in each of the groups they were dealing with. So the different people they were dealing with in the sporting club were different in another way from the people they were dealing with in the Rotary Club or the Lions Club or the church or synagogue, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they formed bonds that spanned almost without their quite noticing it, the entire variety and diversity of the society.
So it was not a monochrome situation, it was something of a polychrome situation existing with the weaving of different threads coming together.
It was exactly that weaving, and I believe, recalling the essay, the Simmel essay on this, that he talks about the interleaving. It's a lattice that forms out of this. And that lattice then brings people together in ways.
Yeah.
Now, of course, what's happened in societies nowadays is that those membership organizations have really weakened immensely. And people, to the extent to which their members are members of things like a Facebook group.
Yes, yes.
Where they're members with other people who are exactly like them. Okay? And that weakens greatly that process that was so important when you look at the history of Australian communities in allowing that fabric
That's
to
a really
develop.
interesting thought. So this multiplicity of contact points that came
Exactly.
through their previous things is now reducing. Reducing into the cohort of like me, and that's danger. Which brings another interesting topic about the whole, to my mind, the whole multicultural debate or polycultural or whatever, and that is the role of the group versus the individual. Now, as I say, I was a Minister of Multicultural Affairs, a proclaimer, and still believe in the dream of the multicultural project in its very best sense. But I do so cautioned very strongly by the words of the late Professor Zabritsky, who gave a lecture in Adelaide on multiculturalism back in the late 1980s. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said. He essentially said that if multiculturalism is to work, it is because the individual has primacy, not the group. In other words, one is defending the right of an individual to be proud of, share his or her inheritances, engaging with the rest of the country, rather than a group imposing upon a group of individuals what their culture is, saying this is what you must do because you are part of our group, and that's the antithesis of what a true multiculturalism should be. Now, I don't know what you think about that premise, and B, with this idea of social media de-individualizing people, perhaps, and taking them back into a cohort.
Yeah. In a sense, there are two processes underway at once, and that really go to the point you make. So the first process, to my mind, is an impoverishment of individual identity. Where individual identity, which is a very complex construct that overlaps with others in myriad ways, collapses to a single point. And as people's sense of identity as such becomes weaker, they become more attached to what there is of it. And so you get the tribalism that is obvious when you look at Facebook groups or other groups in social media. The adversarial tribalism, the tribalism that defines itself by difference rather than by similarity. And so that's the first process, and what it leads to is not the primacy of the individual, but the primacy of the tribal group, which is, for all the reasons that we can readily imagine, extremely dangerous. And the second factor, which then aggravates the first, compounds its impact, is the weakening of the spanning or unifying elements. And I admit this is an uneven process and one that's very complex in its manifestations, but you were earlier talking about shared values. And what has really happened in Australia, as in many other Western countries, is that our shared values have frayed. And they frayed in part because we no longer have what may have been an exaggerated, but nonetheless a real and in some respects at least very valuable pride in commonality. So what's happened to the multicultural project, in my view, in Australia is two things: our sense of difference and of attachment to our differences has become stronger. Our sense of national unity and of national values and of a shared past and even more so of a shared future has become weaker. And it's the combination of the strengthening of the one and the weakening of the other that I think is very worrying and is at the heart of the paper that Alex and I wrote.
I mean, that's where I think there is a desperate necessity to agree on what the core values are that we say are important for our dominion, for the concept of Australia. And where that footprint differs, where one group says they have different ideals about what that means in terms, for example, of the gender equality issues or things like this, that can't be allowed to sustain itself. That has to format within our shared footprint. I'm thinking back to how governments engage with this, and even in the Menzies government, they had the need to do some engagement with this because we had in the early 60s. You mentioned sport clubs. We had sports clubs in this country that were very ethnically based.
Absolutely.
In what we call soccer, and that really had to be put a stop to, because that was focusing the group tribalism at the expense of all the other networks that people may have had in their daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that well, and I remember I'm hopeless on anything to do with sport, but I remember people talking about I can't quite recall the names, but maybe it was South Sydney ALAS and there was a Croatian team
and the Serbian team and
the Serbian team and so on, and of course the matches would all too often degenerate into brawls because a good opportunity to relive old ethnic hatreds would come out.
And that highlights the point that the government chose to do something about that at that time. And really, what does government now have the capacity to do, or what should it be doing in those sorts of situations? At a more benign level, I think government does have a role to try and simply carrot and stick situations. When I was Minister for Education, and we had ethnic schools, Saturday morning schools they're sometimes called, where they would learn the language of their community, and I increased the funding available to those schools. But I said the caveat is this: you will only get the increased funding if you allow your schools to be open to anybody who wants to go there. So anyone who might want to learn Japanese or Vietnamese or French or Italian or Arabic is going to have to be able to go to your school if they want to.
Yes. Look, I think there are all those components of it, but to my mind, in terms of what can be done, I mean, some of it is, as you were saying earlier, making it clear what values are, but also making that important, making that really matter to people, and that's obviously difficult to do. I mean, it's a project in itself, but one component of it that Alex McDermott and I have also written about and emphasized is civics education in schools, and teaching people a common history and understanding of how Australia came to be, and what it means to be Australian in Australia.
Well, that's that shared core values argument again, isn't it? Which is absolutely right. If there is no shared understanding of that. Of course, there is a big argument about what are some of those elements of that. Historiography comes into play very big in that.
Absolutely. And rightly so. We don't want to have myths instead of historical realities. We want to have historical realities, not pleasant myths of the kind that you associate with 19th century romantic nationalism. So that is absolutely true, but that doesn't detract from the importance of having civics education at every level. And let me just mention one other aspect of this, which I think is significant, which is that we've, for good reasons or ill, reduced the value of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So it used to be the case that, for instance, as I knew from personal experience, that to become Australian, you had to forgo any claim to any other nationality.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an explicit requirement, and you had to be absolutely clear that that was what you were doing. You were going to be Australian, you were only going to be Australian.
Well, it's still required in the federal body politic, of course, but the...
It's only required, actually, in Parliament, but you could perfectly well be a public servant, or you could be a judge. But still, it was a core requirement, and it was more than symbolically important, because it meant that you were making a decision that was not costless to you. Instead, at the moment, it is really a costless decision. And indeed, it's a decision that you get all the benefits and none of the costs. And it comes with virtually no requirements of any kind whatsoever. And that's a peculiar thing. That is a very peculiar thing. And yet it happened without almost anyone noticing it or really thinking through its longer-term consequences. And it has been one factor, I don't say it's the only factor, but it has been one factor that has contributed to that weakening of the elements that hold the country together at the expense of the many, many that in any society, but especially in a society like Australia based on migration, will tend to fragment it.
As I understand it, there's the two different forms of the way the citizen of a space can be. One is jus sanguinis, the law of the blood, and one is jus soli, the law of the soil.
Yes.
And we as Australia have jus soli, the law of the soil. You come here, you choose to be of this nationality, and that becomes important. And I take your point that citizenship in that context with dual citizenship becomes a very problematic issue. Where are your loyalties in that situation? I'm not sure that there isn't some space, however, for some dual nationality situations, but maybe that's for another day.
Look, I'm not saying that we should not have dual nationality, because I can see the benefits in it to many people and the significance of it. And I don't believe it's really a question of loyalty as such, in the sense that I don't fear that people being dual nationals will be disloyal or treasonous. Rather, my point is that we have had historically mechanisms that were integrative mechanisms. We've weakened those integrative mechanisms without giving it much thought, and without saying, if we weaken those mechanisms, what else will
do we have left?
What will take their place?
Yeah. And some of those pressures that are weakening them are themselves strengthening. I'm thinking of another issue that has grown up, not just here, but internationally, of the criticism of cultural appropriation, where now there is a copyright to one's own cultural issues that you're not allowed to share. And I think that is a serious move away from the true principles of a multicultural, in the best sense of the word, society, a culturated society, in your phrase. And how do we deal with things like that? Again, they deny the rights of the individual to make decisions about where they wish to place themselves in their own personal cultural tapestry.
No, well, look, I've always thought this cultural appropriation idea was absurd, completely absurd. It sort of flies in the face of many of the things that have been best in cultures, not merely in the anthropological sense, but also in the high culture sense. You struggle to imagine what European culture would have been like had the notion of cultural appropriation been extant centuries ago. I mean, it's a horrifying thought, but it also, it makes very little sense because cultures are not objects. And if you go back to the original meaning, the genealogy, as it were, to use Nietzsche's phrase of the term culture, it shared the same root as agriculture. And it was a term that in the Latin referred to a process of growth. Growth and change. And one of the ways in which that process of growth and change occurred was by cross-pollination. Well, that was one of the most important ways in which it occurs, both in natural processes and in the process of formation of ideas. And so the notion that you would create these artificial boundaries seems to me to run contrary to the entire manner in which the progress of knowledge, literature, art has worked for centuries, and given the benefits in which it's worked, and it leads to completely absurd results. For instance, to my mind, the iconography of Indigenous Australia, which is beautiful iconography, is as much the part of the life of an Australian artist who was born in Wales as it is part of the life of an Australian artist who was born in Arnhem Land. And equally, the iconography of Australian urban life is as much a part of the culture and of the life, the mental life of an Australian born in Arnhem Land, as it is of the life and symbolic existence of an Australian who's born in Adelaide or in Melbourne. And to say that one can only use that iconography and the other one can only use this iconography is to impoverish their symbolic realm and what they can create. And so Margaret Preston becomes unthinkable because of her brilliant blending of distinct iconographies. Now, if that is what we're going to, your polyculturalism, your polyculturalism seems to be the antithesis of culture.
Absolutely. I, in fact, again, coming back to that antithesis idea, when I was minister, I spoke about the fact that the great dream I had was that somebody perhaps from Italian origin coming to Australia and affected by Australia's overwhelming culture would write something, and his or her twin in going to Canada or Africa or somewhere else would write something with all the same experiences in their background, but would write things differently because they'd be affected by where they now are.
Yes.
And yet they would still have some distinct elements of their inheritance. That,
Yes.
to my mind, was the exciting part of multicultural, rather than this exclusionary, shrinking
Yes.
attitude that we now face.
Yeah, and that, I think, is symptomatic of this broader fragmentation into tribes and monads, warring tribes and monads, that has always been a risk in a country like Australia that is based on immigration, and where immigration has provided such immense benefits, but where, if it's to continue to provide those benefits, we have to be conscious of those risks and more deliberately adopt measures to reduce them.
Well, Henry, thank you very much indeed for coming along today. I really appreciate this, your coming to Adelaide to meet with us and talk. And I so appreciate all your insights into all these different topics.
De même, as they say in French, me too. So let me reciprocate and just thank you once again for having me here.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good.